the essence of the
Hey there,
situation
comrades.
is
Welcome to the
this would
Revolution
not have
Report.
happened without the sanctions.
It's
You could have had the
actually a holiday, I guess you
and
could
it was
say,
gone
and I didn't know
pretty
this
much
until
as it has
recently
to
today,
gone.
that today is the
But
anniversary of
the,
Karl Marx's death, so I thought I'd give a
Russian
shout out to my
government
boy there.
in 2022
If there's
was
any
in no
problems with
position to
the
force
sound or
exit of
anything, just
Western
make sure
countries.
to
Didn't
let me
want
know
to,
in the
wouldn't have
chat.
done that.
I'll try
It
and
was in
fix
no
it here on the
position
streaming
to
software.
force its
But
oligarchs to
other
choose
than that,
between
welcome.
Russia
I'm
and
really
the
happy to
US.
see all of
It
you,
didn't wish to
and
do that.
I'll be happy to see all
these
of
choices
the
were
others that
imposed
end
by
up
the
filing
West.
in over the next
Their
several
results
minutes.
were actually,
Before
in
we
many
start, I
respects,
just want to
favorable
welcome some of
to
our
the
new
long-term
patrons on
independent
Patreon,
development of the Russian
CJ and possibly
Federation's
Caitlin.
economy.
That's
I'm James
one
Galbraith,
person.
and
That's the
I
actual
teach
name,
at
an
the
interesting
University
name.
of Texas in Austin.
He or
Well,
she
there were
joined as a
numerous
general
stated
secretary,
goals, and the
and
most
Dylan,
important
who's also
goals
joined
were,
on Patreon as a
to,
general
so to
secretary.
speak,
So,
defund,
comrades, if you like the
the
content, please, I
war,
would
to
encourage you to
deprive
become
Russia
a
of,
patron, or maybe you could
export
send a
revenue,
donation
to
over YouTube.
prevent
It really goes a
Russia
long way
from
in terms of
having
costs,
access,
since this is all
to
run on
critical technologies,
donations
to
and. It looks like
provide,
something
to
else is
put
playing in the
pressure on the
background.
Russian
Oh,
regime,
sorry.
both through the civilian
Yeah, well, sorry about that, guys. The there's a video that I want to show you later on, and I guess that automatically started when I started the broadcast, but we'll get to that later anyway. Yeah, so as I was saying, I'd really like to encourage you to please join us on Patreon. We've got some interesting benefits there as well. We'll read your name at the end of every video, and of course also there's monthly Zoom calls that we have, so you could just chill with us, have a conversation, talk about politics, or ask any questions about life in Russia and everything in that nature. So now that everything's good with the sound, we'll get going. Again, thanks for joining us. We're going to be talking about sanctions today, Western sanctions on Russia. I'm not going to be talking about that much. I'm not going to be talking that much about how they've negatively affected the Western economies. I think that's been talked about a lot in terms of in the alternative media as well as in the mainstream media. I'll talk a little bit about it right now. I mean, obviously we know about the rampant inflation that followed after the deployment of Western sanctions against Russia, rampant inflation in the West specifically. We saw how gas prices got really high as well, and obviously the overall economic situation in America, at least, I mean, I think in the European Union as well, at least statistically I know, but I could tell you from personal experience that the economic situation, for example, in New York and New Jersey, from where I'm from, has gotten significantly worse, especially after the deployment of sanctions, and that's no coincidence either. But if you want to read more about that, actually, one of our comrades, Travis, he wrote an article recently that we literally published just about half an hour ago. He talks about the negative effects on the American working class that these sanctions have had, and other elements of the Biden administration's policies that have negatively affected the American working class in recent times. So if you want to check that out, definitely go to our website, Revolution Report, therevolutionreport.org. We've got all our articles there. If you haven't seen it already, maybe, yeah, I see that admin has put it in the chat, so you guys can see that. We've got a lot of interesting articles there that we do parallel to the video content we're making on YouTube here. So definitely check that out for more information about how Western sanctions have boomeranged onto the West. But they haven't only boomeranged in that aspect. And the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about here is how sanctions, obviously they were intended on destroying the Russian economy after it launched its military operation in Ukraine, how they've boomeranged in a way that's actually in many ways helped Russia in the long run. It's forced it into a path of economic development that is independent, much more independent than it was before. Obviously, Russia for a long time was trying to seek independence. It didn't want to be a colony of the West, but this whole transformation, this whole story of how Russia went from after the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially being ravaged by Western companies and comprador oligarchs in Russia, to the point where it is now, where it's essentially, more or less self-reliant. Obviously, there are other things to consider, like trade partners in the multipolar world, like China and the developing world and other places in the developing world. But in terms of being independent from the West, Russia is, for all intents and purposes, I think, now almost entirely independent, based on what we've seen, based on the outcome of these sanctions, because Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, right? And before that, I'm pretty sure it was Iran, or North Korea. I'm pretty sure it was Iran. I don't remember correctly, but obviously sanctions have had a serious impact on North Korea and Iran. But on Russia, it's just taken it into an entirely different direction. So before I start to talk about that, I want to go through the sort of history of how Russia got to this point, in terms of starting with the fall of the Soviet Union and coming up to the current day, in terms of Russian government policy and how it's seen its relationship to the West, right? And I want to start with a period in time which I personally categorize as something I call the naive period in Russian politics. And I've been, I actually might write a book or at least several articles about it in the future, but because I think it really has to be written about. And a lot of people know about the fact that leaders in this period in Russia were naively trusting the West, but I think an entire work needs to be done about it. But anyway, the naive period what I call the naive period, it's basically the period of Russian leadership between Gorbachev to the early Putin years, basically. Maybe even like mid-Putin years as well. So that's Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin. I call it the naive period because it's a period in time, in terms of the Russian government, where policy was aimed towards being friends with the West, even though obviously everyone who's watching, I don't know if everyone who's watching is from the West, but the majority of our audience is from the West, and if you're from the West, you probably understand much more than the leaders of the Soviet Union and Russia during this naive period, that the West had no interest in actually having a mutually beneficial relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, right? During Gorbachev's time, he was making concessions to like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the two of the most like anti-Soviet, anti-communist leaders in the history of the Cold War, making nuclear concessions, making economic concessions in terms of bourgeois reforms in the Soviet Union. And obviously Gorbachev got nothing in return except for a good job from Thatcher and Reagan, a thank you for completely surrendering your position. Obviously we know what happened after that. Fall of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin comes to power. Obviously, he's the West's favorite president of modern Russia, because he essentially did nothing to stop the Western capitalists from absolutely ravaging everything all of the industrial capacity that was built up during the Soviet Union. He did absolutely nothing to stop even Russian capitalists too that did exactly the same thing, and he was getting rich off of it also, so he didn't care. And then this naive period, which I call the naive period, it ends towards the beginning of Putin's administration. Because I don't know if you guys know, but Vladimir Putin was connected to the Yeltsin administration. He kind of like came to power with the Yeltsin administration's blessing. So he didn't come in, as this guy who was like, we're going to fight with the West. Actually, he was for decades trying to cooperate with the West. I wouldn't say he was conciliatory to the West, but he had this idea that, we're not communist anymore, so the West should want to do business with us. And obviously we know now by historic events that it doesn't matter if Russia's communist or bourgeois in terms of its, the class character of its society. The West always wanted to make Russia into a colony. The reason it became communist is to prevent that, because communist economics, allowed for independent development, state control of the economy, so the Western corporations couldn't come in and colonize the economy, as they were doing under the Tsar already. So even when Russia became capitalist, I mean, the West didn't change their idea about that. They're like, okay, capitalist now, but you're not in the you're not in the Western core. You're in the periphery. We want to make a colony out of you. So it was throughout Putin's administration that he started to realize this. And of course, Moscow never wanted to become dependent on the West. But like I said, they naively believed that there could be some sort of mutually beneficial relationship with the West. And so I'm going to start with some of the stuff that Putin said back in like 2000, early 2000s. He said that he couldn't imagine his country isolated from Europe and, quote, what we often call the civilized world, end quote. That's something Putin said in 2000. Around the same time, Vladimir Putin even tried to take Russia into NATO. I mean, I know a lot of people know about this now, especially because of the interview he recently did with Tucker Carlson, but a lot of people didn't know that before. And according to Vladimir Putin, he was told when he was entertaining the idea of bringing Russia into NATO that it wasn't even worth sending an official application because it was going to be denied. So NATO, never had a defensive character. It was never an inclusive defensive organization. It was always aimed with imperialist goals against Russia, against the Soviet Union when it was founded. But now we're going to talk about how this changed, right? I call it the period from when Putin went from comprador to Bonapartist, because a comprador obviously is, a capitalist in a country, or a government official, or a leader who represents the interests of a foreign imperialist power in their own country. And usually, obviously, the point of them doing that is that they get rich as a result of allowing for this exploitation of the country. But that period with Putin didn't last very long, to be honest. Again, he came to power in the late 90s, and already by 2000, he was starting to get the picture. He already made the first steps towards trying to rectify this problem. And I would say that all started with a very important and landmark meeting that he held in the summer of 2000 with the country's most powerful oligarchs, the people who ravaged the country in the 90s, essentially, through banditry, criminal activities, stealing, corruption, all this stuff. I mean, if you're watching the Revolution Report and you're interested in communism, you probably know about that period. But this meeting that he had in the summer of 2000 with these oligarchs, it was like 21 oligarchs he had at this meeting, which that might sound like a small amount of people, but at that period in Russian history, it was like basically the people who ran the entire country. And Putin gave them an ultimatum, essentially. He said, get with the state's national program or you're going to be in trouble, essentially. And in return for compliance, Vladimir Putin told these people that the government's not going to take revenge for what they did in 1990s. The property they have, okay, they can keep it. There will be no sort of repatriation of property, no seizing of property, as long as you get with the national program and you understand who's boss. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone complied. There were several oligarchs who basically told Vladimir Putin to go screw himself. I mean, I thought about putting names here and telling you about the names, but they won't really mean anything to most of you. If you're interested in learning about the specific people who complied and who didn't comply, you can find it on the internet. Just look up like Putin oligarchs meeting 2000 and you'll find it on the internet. But those who resisted, essentially, they were either arrested or had warrants put out for their arrest, mostly associated to tax fraud, because basically everyone was avoiding taxes at that point, or they were forced to move abroad, like in the case of Browder, for example. I think Bill Browder, the grandson of the former head of the American Communist Party, funny enough. But I even have a quote that I found here from a New York Times article. They claim that Putin said this. They have insider sources. So just so you know, I mean, this is just what the New York Times says that he said. But the quote is, quote, I want to draw your attention to the fact that you built this state yourself to a great degree through the political and semi-political structures under your control. He's telling the oligarchs that, controlled the country at that point. So there's no point in blaming the reflection in the mirror. So let's get down to the point and be open and do what is necessary to make our relationship in this field civilized and transparent. So that, end quote. That's according to the New York Times, what Vladimir Putin told these oligarchs at this meeting. And if you remember a couple of minutes ago, I said that this was a transformation of Vladimir Putin from a sort of comprador figure to a Bonapartist figure. So what do I mean by Bonapartist? This is a concept in Marxism. And if you haven't already read it, I highly suggest reading The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It is the book that Karl Marx wrote that basically established this concept. It's something that doesn't happen very often, but in the case of Russia, I think this classification of leader very accurately describes Vladimir Putin's class position in Russian society. Karl Marx describes Bonapartism as a socio-political situation in which basically the state bureaucracy itself controls the ruling class in society, as opposed to the other way around, which is usually the case. Like in the American situation, for example, obviously we know the state is completely controlled by corporate interests. Politicians don't really run the show. Candidates are chosen behind closed doors before even the primaries happen through things called money elections or money primaries, where all of the major donors of the two main political parties all get into a room with the candidates that want to run, the potential candidates, and these potential candidates have to convince the wealthy donors, which represent obviously all the boards of directors of the most, the biggest corporations in the country. The potential candidates have to prove to these corporations essentially that they can represent their interests. And if the corporations are happy with that proof, then they get election funding, campaign funding. And if they don't, then they don't. That's one of the reasons why Donald Trump was obviously really controversial for the ruling class in the United States, because he was a billionaire himself and he was able to fund his own campaign. That's not supposed to happen in the ordinary capitalist bourgeois democracy system. In Russia, as I just explained, it's really the other way around. The state tells the oligarchs what's going to happen and what's not going to happen in terms of politics. And if they don't like that, then they're going to be in trouble. This is Bonapartism, essentially. And the specific aspect of Bonapartism, what gives rise to Bonapartism, and why it happens not very often. It's a very rare historical occurrence, actually. It's always following a period of chaos and upheaval in society, because the situation that develops that allows the government to take control of the class situation in a country in such a way happens because the chaos and the social upheaval that took place before didn't allow the ruling class of society to actually unite and rule society as like a concrete class, because they're fighting amongst each other. They couldn't unite as a class. They couldn't come up with some sort of unified system for governing the state or society. Their interests among the ruling class just could not consolidate or unite, which was the case, obviously, in the 1990s, right? You had all these different oligarchs, bandits, vying for power, competing with each other very violently sometimes to essentially expand their control over the means of production, over the economic property of society. And Putin came to power with this attitude of controlling the situation before any order could naturally come to being in that situation. And so we have this Bonapartist situation in Russia, where the state bureaucracy controls the ruling class, not the other way around. And what obviously is progressive about this situation in Russia is that the state bureaucracy is anti-imperialist. It's aimed against the Western imperialist core. And this is why, I personally think that even though I'm a communist, I want to support the Russian government bureaucracy because it's controlling the oligarchs in the country and it's using the nation's resources for an anti-imperialist purpose. So again, like I said, definitely read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte because it'll give you a better understanding of this concept. It's a very interesting one in Marxism. And you'll also learn a bit of history too, because it's about this concept came to being after the chaos that came after the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, and then the Restoration, and then the kings that came after, the bourgeoisie's struggle for power. So there's a bunch of different historical factors that played into Marx's analysis in terms of coming up with this understanding of the class character of Russian society. And, this is also the official line of the Russian Communist Party as well. So I think, they understand the situation very well as well. So essentially, after all this happened, after Putin and the Russian government got the situation under control, and they, disenfranchised the oligarchs that were comprador. They got the national bourgeoisie under control. Essentially, the Russian government thought that this was going to be enough to ensure the sovereignty of the country, and that they would be able to move on to have a sort of mutually beneficial relationship with the West. Like I said, because the idea was we're bourgeois now, and we're not communists, so you don't have to hate us. But they soon learned that it's not. The Russia wasn't hated because it was communist. It was hated because it was standing up for its sovereignty. We obviously saw this develop in the the events that came after. Obviously, the one that's most pertinent right now that everyone's talking about, thinking about, is back in 2014 when the U.S. sponsored a neo-fascist-backed coup, Euromaidan, in Ukraine, which brought this horrible government in Kiev now to power. And then the U.S. sanctioned Russia for the way it reacted to it. The sanctions in 2014 were obviously not as bad as the sanctions we're seeing now, but because of the fact that before that, Russia had, the intent of being integrated with the West, cooperating with the West on the same kind of level as France cooperates with Germany or with the United States or whatever. Because of the fact that they hadn't prepared for being sanctioned or having some sort of super independent path of development, the Russian economy was significantly affected by these sanctions. It was really negatively affected. But it was also a learning experience for Vladimir Putin's administration, because it showed them that, okay, we can't be so integrated with the West to allow them to have this kind of power over us. But it didn't. Even at that point, it didn't really convince the Russian leadership that they had to that there was no chance for cooperating with the West on a mutually beneficial basis. The idea at that point was just, okay, we need to make sure that we can protect our economic sovereignty, but we got to continue to try to be diplomatic and talk and not be their enemy. But like I said, although it didn't at that point rule out entirely making friends, the situation surrounding Ukraine now is basically what I think was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because in early 2021, when things were getting tense between the West and Russia and in Ukraine, and early 2022 as well, Moscow was trying to solve the Donbass conflict diplomatically, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was constantly meeting with Western officials. Putin was constantly making diplomatic statements. They were constantly saying, let's abide by the Minsk protocols. Let's abide by the Minsk protocols, which were negotiated in 2015 to try to put an end to the fighting in the Donbass conflict, which started obviously after Ukraine launched its anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass republics that decided they didn't want to live under a neo-fascist regime, which is why really the Ukraine conflict started back then. You know, it wasn't Russia that started the conflict. It started with if you want to start at the beginning from this whole thing, it was really Ukraine that started it because they launched an invasion of the newly independent People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. But it was really after trying to negotiate on the eve of the Russian military operation for months, trying to get the West to exclude NATO membership for Ukraine, trying to diplomatically achieve some sort of demilitarization in the region because of the conflict that was going on, and just being, you know, slapped constantly by the West, saying, no, we're not going to make you any guarantees, we're not going to make you any guarantees, no. It's only after that that Russia decided to launch its military operation. And, you know, obviously there were other things that contributed to this as well, like the fact that Ukraine was preparing for another offensive on Donbass as well. This is stuff that is rarely talked about in the West. And also now we know, thanks to Angela Merkel and the former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, we know that the Minsk protocols were not even negotiated in good faith by the West. They had negotiated that to try and stall for time for an impending conflict with Russia that they, from the very beginning, had planned was going to happen. But obviously Russia was trying to abide by these protocols. And what came along, obviously, with the beginning of the Russian military operation were these sanctions. Sanctions on an unprecedented level. These kinds of sanctions we had never seen before. Russia's now, after these sanctions, the most sanctioned country in the world. They were supposed to destroy the Russian economy. They were supposed to bring Russia to its knees. And yet, it didn't. In fact, it did exactly the opposite. And even now, the mainstream is talking about this in the West. I found this video on YouTube. It was like suggested to me, and I watched it, and I was like, wow, this was the inspiration for me to do this live stream, actually, because it's the YouTube channel is just some like bourgeois economics YouTube channel, but the guy talking in the video, his name is James K. Galbraith. He's the former executive director of the Joint Economic Committee in the U.S. Congress. Now he's a professor and a bourgeois economist. And he's talking all about how sanctions not only didn't work, but they actually helped Russia in a number of ways. And so on this live stream, I want to show you guys a couple parts from this video, and then we can talk about it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience in Russia, because I do have, I obviously live in Moscow, and I've seen all this with my own eyes transpire. By the way, someone in the chat put that he'd like to see me going through a grocery store for you guys. I was thinking maybe in a future live stream we can do that. We can live stream from a Russian grocery store, and I can show you guys what's there, because there's, you know, everything that was there essentially from that there was before these sanctions were launched. They were not there for a little while, but it took like several months for the Russian government to adapt and just like replace all that stuff with parallel imports. So now instead of, you know, Russian writing on our Coca-Cola bottles, there's Arabic writing because it's parallel imported from the United Arab Emirates or something, you know. But anyway, so I'm going to go through this video I'm going to put on now, and we're going to go through a couple parts of it. I got 4 parts here that I found to be particularly interesting, and I think I just want to let this guy speak for himself because he explains it very well, actually. So let's take a look at the first part.
The essence of the situation is this would not have happened without the sanctions. You could have had the war, and it would have gone pretty much as it has gone. But the Russian government in 2022 was in no position to force the exit of Western firms. It didn't want to, wouldn't have done that. It was in no position to force its oligarchs to choose between Russia and the West. It didn't wish to do that. These choices were imposed by the West, and their results were actually, in many respects, favorable to the long-term independent development of the Russian Federation's economy. I'm James.
Thanks. I forgot to unmute the mic. So the reason I wanted to show specifically this part of the video is because, I mean, he talks about it later in the video, but in the actual video that was posted, it put it at the beginning because it's one of the most important parts, right? Sanctions forced Russia to choose a path of essentially hyper-independent development. And it's a path that's more independent than Russia had previously even expected to embark upon, right? The oligarchs that were allowed to continue to be oligarchs in the as long as they got with the national program, right? They were still allowed to have foreign assets. They were still allowed to obviously do business with the West. There were tons of foreign companies still in Russia. It was just under way more control than it was in the 90s. And now, even much of that has been completely cut off, right? There's tons of Western companies that have left Russia, and they've been replaced by Russian companies, essentially. Their workplaces have just been occupied by Russians. And the Russian economy is continuing to develop despite that. So this next part talks about the sanctions that specifically targeted sale of oil and gas from Russia to the rest of the world. And he makes a really interesting point here as well about how that didn't work out either. So I'm going to put that on now. Let's take a listen.
Of facts, and that was the question that the paper really tries to address. Well, there was a reduction in the flow of Russian oil and gas, other materials, minerals in particular, to their Western markets. So then the question was, how does that affect, let's say, Russia's access to international purchasing power? And the answer to that was, it didn't, because although Russia sold a smaller volume of oil and gas, it sold it at a higher price. So its export revenues actually increased, didn't decrease. And secondly, the effect of the other sanctions restricting Russian imports meant that Russia was spending less on, for example, imported consumer goods than it had been. And so Russia's current account surplus went up. So if you believe that foreign funding was somehow essential to the Russian war effort, actually the sanctions increased Russia's access to foreign funds. Now, I in fact don't believe that this was material in all to the Russian war effort because, in fact, the Russian war effort was entirely constructed, almost entirely constructed from within Russia. So their access to dollars or euro was essentially immaterial. But that was the argument that was being made, and on its own merits, it failed on the grounds I've just stated.
So as you saw there, I mean, he talks about how specifically sanctioning oil and gas didn't really go the way it was supposed to. I mean, not only, and it's something that he didn't mention also, is that Russia was able to find different markets, right? I mean, they already sold this stuff to places like India and China, but after the sanctions were launched, they significantly increased the amount of sales to different countries outside of the Western world. And you know, like he talks about, this professor, the just making sure you guys can hear me, despite the lower volume, the price was higher. And so export revenue actually increased. And he also talks about how dollars and euros were immaterial to Russia's war effort as well. Another important point to make here is that before the military operation began, because of what happened in 2014, Russia had also made a point to get rid of as much of its dollar and euro reserves as possible. So the majority of Russia's reserves right now are in gold and national currencies of the trading partners that it mostly trades with, specifically China. So when the West launches sanctions against a country like that, it makes that they're rendered inert. This next part, he talks about the way industrial capacity adapted in Russia, about how the attempt to sanction Russia's industries didn't make a difference. The fact that Western companies left just meant that Russian companies ended up taking over the factories and the managers and experts and workers that were left behind. Let's take a look.
Capacity to produce these major products, for example, automobiles, didn't go away. The factories were there, the workers were there, the managers were there, the engineering was there. So what they needed to do was to replace some designs and some equipment, which they were able to do, in some cases with the assistance of the Chinese, as the Chinese are now major exporters of automobiles. So they converted lines that had previously been, let's say, Japanese or European, to Russian lines, Moskvich, Lada, using Chinese designs, and they've restarted those production lines. I don't know that they are back yet to the volumes that they were previously producing, but they'll get there. Clearly the industry has been transformed from one which was oriented toward the West to one which is no longer oriented toward the West. And that's really the effect that the sanctions have had on the Russian civilian economy. And that's true for both durables and non-durables, poultry and cheese and other grains and fruits and vegetables, all lots of things that Russia imported from Europe or from Turkey. They have, in the last 8 years, and especially in the last year or so, basically reshored or onshored to the Russian Federation itself. And so they're taking advantage of the opportunities that sanctions gave them. If you go back to the period before the
So, like he said there, right? Industrial capacity didn't go away. And this ties into the next part I want to show you guys, actually, because this guy even goes as far, this bourgeois economist, he even goes as far to say that the Russian economy used to be colonized by Western firms, and that sanctions is a gift to the Russian economy because it basically allowed Russia to get away from that situation. And it's part of what really I think is Russia, as a result of Western aggression against it, is kind of being forced into a position where obviously it's not becoming socialist, but it's being forced into a position where it has to adapt a lot of the attitudes towards the economy that were prevalent during the Soviet period, right? There's obviously not a centrally planned economy in Russia right now, but the more this stuff happens, the more sanctions there are, the more need there is to defend Russia against Western aggression, the more the economy is coming more and more under the direction of the Russian government. And personally, I think that's a positive development. But let's take a listen to this last part I wanted to show you guys.
opportunities that sanctions gave them. If you go back to the period before the introduction of sanctions in 2014 and even up until 2022, the Russian economy was very heavily colonized by Western firms. That was true, again, automobiles, it was true in aircraft, it was true in everything from fast food restaurants, big box stores. Western firms were present all throughout the Russian economy. A great many of them, not all, but a great many of them, either chose to exit Russia or were pressured to exit Russia after early 2022. So on what terms did they leave? Well, they were required, if they were leaving permanently, to sell their capital equipment, their factories and so forth, to, let's say, a Russian business, which would get a loan from the Russian banks or maybe have other sources of financing at a very favorable price for the Russians. So effectively, a lot of capital wealth, which was partly owned by the West, has been transferred to Russian ownership. And you now have an economy which is moving forward and has the advantage compared to Europe of relatively low resource costs, because Russia is a great producer of resources, oil and gas and fertilizer and foodstuffs and so forth. And so while the Europeans are paying maybe twice in Germany what they were paying for energy, the Russians are not. They're paying perhaps no more and perhaps less than they were paying before the war. So again, I characterize the effect of the sanctions, in fact, as being, in certain respects, a gift to the Russian economy. And this.
So yeah, there you have it. I mean, it doesn't even take a communist or like some pro-Russian government economist to tell you that the sanctions aren't working. And I mean, it's part of, I think the same clique of people in the West who are ruling the United States, it's part of their delusion about what Russia is and their lack of understanding. Because, I mean, time and time again they deploy stuff like this, and it really doesn't have the effect that they had intended. And I've got some statistics here that reflect what this economist is talking about and reflect the experience that I've had in Russia as well. Like there's no economic crisis going on over here. In 2023, Russian economic growth actually outpaced that of the U.S. and Europe. It grew at 3.6% when it was supposed to be suffering from sanctions, and unemployment in the country was also at a record low. For 2024, the IMF originally predicted that Russia was supposed to have 1.1% economic growth, and recently they revised their figure to 2.6, and frankly, I think they're going to revise it again to be even higher. Another thing that is also interesting that I wanted to mention, which isn't necessarily connected to the economy, but well, it is, but it's not connected to growth, but rather to military production. Russia produces 3 times more artillery shells yearly than the U.S. and the European Union combined, which they're sending to Ukraine. That's according to CNN, right? That's hilarious, because CNN just like last year was saying that Russia was having a munitions shortage, and Russia is producing 3 times more than the U.S. and European Union, their combined artillery shell contribution to Ukraine, right? So, and obviously, artillery shells specifically are critical to this conflict specifically, because obviously the conditions, unfortunately, have begun to resemble that of World War I, and artillery is a decisive factor in these battles. So with Russia producing 3 times more than the U.S. and the European Union combined sending to Ukraine, it's laughable that the West can continue to think that sending these munitions and sending more people to die in Ukraine is a good idea, but obviously they're not thinking about human lives, they're thinking about how to make a buck. In my experience here through sanctions, I'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll end the live stream here. Like I said earlier, things like Coca-Cola, they disappeared after sanctions. For several months, and then all of a sudden they started to reappear, just with either Korean writing on it or Arabic writing or Spanish writing. They're just they were completely replaced by parallel imports. There was never a shortage of food or anything like that. I think the only effect of sanctions, apart from obviously stuff like iPhones got a little bit more expensive, but they're not even that much more expensive than in the West. But the only thing that I noticed happened in Russia, and I think it's almost definitely a result of sanctions, is that eggs got a bit more expensive. But what's funny is that, and they called it eggflation in Russia, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, the price of eggs is skyrocketing," because the at one point the price of eggs here tripled, right? But even when they tripled, the eggs still were not as expensive as they are in the European Union or in the United States, because eggs in Russia are like super cheap, and the price even went down afterwards. So that's basically the entire extent of what I've personally seen, the consequences of sanctions here. And I think it might be a good idea to do like a sort of grocery store tour for the Revolution Report here in Russia. Maybe do a live stream about that. The reason why I didn't do it is because I already saw tons of videos like that on YouTube that different pro-Russian YouTubers did about sanctions and everything. But we could do that. I've got there's some grocery stores around the corner that we can go to, and I could show you several, really, because near me there's like several different levels of grocery stores. There's one that's like cheap and not that great. There's another one that's middle range and more quality, and I think I could even there's one called Azbuka Vkusa, which is like the most bourgeois grocery store I've ever seen. I mean, we could go there. It's like the prices are they're so ridiculously high for no reason, and I don't even know who goes there. But I guess the quality is really good. Whatever. But anyway, that's that, comrades. So, I mean, the anti-Russian sanctions really haven't had the effect that they wanted to, and essentially, the Russian government's better off without the West trying to make money in the country and helping Russian businesses, the development of the domestic economy. So now, after this this war's over and done with, which it will be someday, right? The U.S. is going to have an even harder time trying to control Russia than it did before the military operation began. So on that note, comrades, I want to say thank you again for joining us on the Revolution Report for this live stream. We're going to try to do these weekly. I've got a lot of interesting ideas for live streams that you guys might find interesting. We want to do some not only on contemporary events like this, but also maybe some on Marxist theory, some on more philosophical, theoretical topics as well. I think that'd be interesting. And I hope you'll find it interesting as well. But once again, comrades, if you're not already a member of our Patreon community, please give it a consideration. Like I said, there's a lot of benefits. We'll honor you at the end of our videos. We can just chill once a month at a Zoom call, one-on-one. You'll be more than welcome to join us. And it just really goes a long way to helping the production process for the Revolution Report. Because like I said, we don't I mean, there are advertisements on the YouTube videos, but I just we get like $2 to $5 a month on that stuff, and I only enabled them because otherwise YouTube will take the money and still put advertisements on it anyway. So we really rely on your donations and on my wallet for it. But anyway, comrades, thanks again. Give Patreon consideration. I appreciate that you all showed up. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time on the Revolution Report, and Workers of the World Unite.